a very similar algorithm to that used by your dopamine neurons. It's called temporal difference learning or prediction error learning, in the sense that it makes predictions and then compares these predictions to what actually happens. It sounds very straightforward, and it is, but it's a very efficient way to learn, and that's how your cells learn. That's how they evolved to learn over millions and millions and millions of years. I think for the first time we're starting to apply that to things like backgammon programs, but it's also being used to program banks of elevators, cell phone towers. It turns out to be a very efficient way to learn.
One of the things that you give many examples of in your book is how our decision-making processes get in our way. And one of the examples that you gave was about how people are willing to commute long distances just to live in a bigger house. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about that calculus and how it is that, you know, people are kind of willing to make themselves miserable for 2 hours a day in order to have a guest room.
This is kind of related to the work we talked about earlier in terms of strawberry jam and how we come up with all these reasons. The brain is so great at generating reasons. And even when these reasons don't apply, even when they're irrelevant, they sound good to us, and so we end up following them. So this is preliminary work done by researchers at the University of the Netherlands. What they did was they asked people to compare, options we're all pretty familiar with, so that you can have a big house in the suburbs, 4-bedroom house, 3.5 bathrooms. The problem is there's a 1-hour commute each way. Or plan B is a condo in the city. It's only 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, but it's a 5-minute walk to the office. So when you ask people what they'll choose, and if you just have them choose right away, it's about split 50-50. They tend to choose the condo just more than half the time, right? Because they think about, commuting's terrible. That would stink to have to commute, an hour each day. So they choose the condo. However, the more time you give them to contemplate these options, the more important that extra bedroom becomes. They start thinking about, Grandpa Joe can visit on Christmas. He could stay in the bed on Christmas. The extra bathroom would be so helpful when my sister visits. Oh, and when the kids come home from college, they could really use that extra bedroom too. So we come up with all these reasons why that extra bedroom is essential, even when we're really only going to use it 3 times a year. And so the end result, and what we fail to really think about, is just how awful commuting is. When you give people beepers and then beep them at random intervals and ask them to rate how happy they are, what you find is that they're least happy when commuting. That commuting is about as bad as it gets in terms of daily activities. This is for a variety of reasons, because it's unpredictable, so you can never fully adapt to the pain of commuting. And so people come up with all these reasons why that extra bedroom is so important, and stop thinking about what actually is important, which is that commuting sucks, and that it makes you very unhappy to commute an hour.
Some of you who came a long way to be here tonight, yeah, I'm sure lead really happy lives.
Yes.
But go ahead.
But so that's a classic example, and I think it's an example many Americans, it's a mistake many Americans are making. These long, extreme commuters are the fastest growing segment of commuters, people who have to commute 2 hours each way or more. So this really is, in a sense, a byproduct of thinking too much, of obsessing over the wrong things, obsessing over the extra bedroom when we should really be obsessing over sitting on the 101 freeway for an hour every morning.
Well, this kind of brings me to a question of, you give many examples of how you should use your rational brain here, you should rely more on your emotional brain there. Well, how are we supposed to know when I'm making any given decision? Should I go with my gut? Should I go with my brain, especially if they're conflicting? Do you have any guidelines for us about how to decide whether or not to commute or buy the house, or whether or not to buy that cashmere sweater?
I've got some rough guidelines in the book. It's important to note this is very preliminary science, and so you can extract as best you can a self-help manual based on the fMRI research and cell recordings and stuff like that. But I think the most important lesson to take away, and the most important moral we can all learn from this research, is something called metacognition, trying to cultivate metacognition. I love metacognition because it sounds like a very complex word. It sounds intimidating, but it's really the simplest thing. It's thinking about thinking. Probably the classic example of metacognition is a tip of the tongue moment, when you meet someone on the street and you know their name, it's in your head somewhere, but you can't quite summon it to the surface. And that's always struck me as very profound, how you know what you don't know, how you have a memory of a name if you can't produce it. And that's because we're naturally metacognitive. We naturally think about thinking. And when it comes to decision making, this can be a really important skill in the sense that it allows you to properly adjust your thought process to the task at hand. So given what scientists have discovered in terms of when the emotional brain is useful, or when we should really flex our prefrontal cortex and try to think things through, whether, we're a pilot in a cockpit and we just lost engine power, or we're trying to act on all sorts of information that's out of our control, whether or not we're trying to choose which house to buy or which strawberry jam to buy. So given that science knows that certain situations benefit from certain types of thinking, metacognition allows you to really adjust your thought process to the task at hand. And that, I think, is how learning about how the brain works and how the brain makes decisions can actually make you a better decider.
It seems to me that meditation is basically the process of metacognition. And I know that some neuroscientists have looked at the brains of Buddhist monks, people who've meditated for a long time. And I'm wondering if you know anything about how meditation can affect our decision-making processes.
Yeah, I think meditation is a perfect example of metacognition. It's an extreme form, but I think there's some really suggestive evidence that a lot of it based on Buddhist monks, that metacognition can really transform the structure of your brain and how you think. And one of my favorite examples comes from the work of a guy named Mark Beam at Northwestern University and John Cunios at Drexel, and they study moments of insight, what happens in your brain when you have an epiphany. And what they found is that these epiphanies, these moments of insight, tend to come from relatively obscure circuit of cells in the right hemisphere, and that it's easiest to access these circuit of cells, to listen to what they have to say when we're relaxed, when we're not too focused on a particular problem. That's why when you're stuck on a problem and you just really try to focus on it, you just come up with the same wrong solution over and over and over again. What you should be doing is taking a warm shower, going for a long walk, finding some way to relax yourself, to distract yourself enough so that you can kind of tap into these remote associations. So back to Buddhist monks and metacognition. So they tell this great story about how one day they were measuring a Buddhist monk. They had this really cute experimental protocol where they give people word problems and have them generate insights. And so they gave this Buddhist monk these word problems, and at first he couldn't solve a single one. And this confused them because, he was a smart guy, and normally these word problems are solved about 40% of the time, and yet he couldn't solve a single one. What was going wrong? But then, after about 35 failed word problems, failed moments of insight, he started solving one insight problem after another. He became, as John Cunios put it to me, an insight machine. And what they believed was happening was that because he was a practiced meditator, he developed these incredible metacognitive skills. And at first he was simply too focused on the word problems. He was so locked in that he couldn't listen to this obscure circuit of cells in his right hemisphere. And so he couldn't solve a single one. But then after about 35, he got the hang of it. He realized that what he had to do was focused on not being focused. And that's when he became an insight machine. That's when he solved one problem after another. And so I think it's an extreme example, but something we can all hope to cultivate, which is this ability to learn how to direct our thoughts. And in the case of that Buddhist monk, you can see that it had this tremendous payoff.
Yeah. I noticed in your book that the studies seem to be gender neutral, and or at least gender wasn't mentioned, and you didn't mention gender in the book. And of course, stereotypically, we all think of women as being more intuitive and men as being more rational. And I'm wondering, in your research, what you've found about the truth of that, if there really are big differences between men and women, or is that the topic of your next book?
It's not the topic of my next book, I think it's safe to say. I think when you talk to most decision-making scientists, they're pretty scornful of that cliche. They're pretty scornful of that generalization. I think one reason we tend to imagine women being more intuitive and more emotional gets back to the fact that for most of Western history, we scorned the emotions. We thought the emotions were things you should ignore and repress. They were the bad side of cognition. And so I think because we saw the female mind, for all sorts of terrible, erroneous, sexist reasons, as being somehow inferior to the male mind, one way we tarnished the female mind was to say, oh, it's more emotional, it's more intuitive, it's more precious and fragile. So I think in general, what you see is that a lot of the crucial brain areas for decision making are bilateral. They're gender neutral in that sense. One, I think, interesting thing that I think some studies have found, and this is largely based on the work of a guy named Colin Kammerer at Caltech, is when you have people play a trust game. It's a simple economic game where you have to trust someone else with your money, and then they invest it, and if they decide to give you your money back, and they don't violate your trust, then you get more money in return. So it's a simple economic exchange game. It's been played by economists for a long time. When you put people in a brain scanner, what you find is there's a slight gender difference. That men will play the game, they'll hand over their money, and then as soon as they get money in return, or don't get money in return, their trust has been violated, their brain shuts off. They basically stop thinking about the exchange. So the brain areas that light up when they're contemplating the trust game, the economic exchange, turn off within a few seconds of the exchange being completed.
Now, is that conditioned or is that hardwired?
That seems to be pretty universal. Most men will play the game that way, where they think about the exchange while it's happening, and then once it's over, they're done with it. They're ready to move on to the next exchange. Women, however, play the game a bit differently. They play the economic exchange game, and they'll hand over their money or not hand over the money, and then depending on what happens, they'll keep on mulling it over. So their brain, you can see their brain keep on contemplating this interaction. And I think, the reason I like this is the gender difference that I tend to not kind of disparage or brush aside is because it does jive a bit better with my own personal experience. My wife and I will go to a dinner party, and we come home, and I'm ready to read something or fall asleep or watch SportsCenter or whatever, and she's interested in talking at the dinner party some more. She's interested in kind of pursuing the social interaction a bit more. And I think it's an experience that many people are familiar with. It's a gross generalization, to be sure, so you don't want to push it too hard, but I think it's a generalization that may, and may is the important word here, have some basis in the brain, that women are more sensitive to social interactions. The reason they're more sensitive is because they think about them more, and that once the exchange or interaction is done, they keep on thinking about it.
We're going to take questions from the audience in just a couple of minutes, so if you'd like to ask a question, now would be the time to stand up and get ready to ask your question. Now, isn't it true, I've read stories that on the very high end of rationality, like in super high-end math, men are better than women?
That question's a bit beyond my purview, but I mean, these things are all very tough. I think it's very tough. There's so many variables at work here in terms of
nature, nurture.
Mm-hmm. It's tough to imagine there being a set of math genes that are somehow relegated to the Y chromosome. So I think it's important to kind of reject the extreme at both ends. And there may be a slight preference. It may be easier for men to learn math, but again, I think the evidence at this point is very, very inconclusive.
Now, I just want to ask you a quick question about your previous book. Proust was a neuroscientist, which is about writers and painters and composers who discovered some truths about the human mind that you say that science is only now discovering. And you gave examples of Proust, Cézanne, a lot of the modernists, Virginia Woolf. And I'm just wondering if you can give us a little taste of that book and tell us what you mean by these artists anticipating neuroscience.
Sure. I got the idea for the book. I was working in a lab, and we were studying the chemistry of memory, what happens in your brain when you make a memory. And I had to read Proust for school, and so I was reading Swann's Way, and it's a novel that's really about one man's memory. It's an investigation into Marcel's own childhood memories. And probably the most famous scene in Swann's Way is when Proust, Marcel the narrator, dips a Madeleine, a lemon seashell-shaped cookie, into his tea. And then all of a sudden he puts the cookie, the butter crumbs in his mouth, and he's got this seized with this intense childhood memory that he thought he'd forgotten. But he says very explicitly that it's by taste and smell alone that the memory came flooding back to him, that he'd seen madeleines and bakeries all across Paris and never remembered anything. It wasn't until he put the cookie in his mouth and inhaled the sweet crumbs with the lime flower tea that the memories returned. And that actually, unbeknownst to Proust at the time, that actually captures a very interesting bit of cerebral anatomy, that the olfactory cortex, the part of brain that actually responds to smell and taste, that's actually uniquely connected to the hippocampus. It's got a direct connection to the hippocampus, which is the center of long-term memory. All your other senses have to go somewhere else first and then go to the hippocampus. So in a sense, Proust was right, that our sense of smell and taste is uniquely nostalgic. And he intuited this simply by being a very sensitive observer of how his own mind worked. And that's just a small example of what Proust and others discovered. But I think it gets back to, the larger idea of artists aren't just trying to spin us, entertaining tales, fantasies and fictions. What they're also trying to do